Danke für die Einführung. Thanks. Yeah, hello. Nice to see you all here. Applying Web3 to funding and organizing culture. We want to look in this conversation in particular to what changes. There are lots of, I think, proposals that are being made in the Web3 space. And we want to look a little bit into those projections into the future, but also what's actually happening today. And I'm really excited about this panel because I'm looking forward to hear from really each one of you from your experiences and your work and I think you all have a very unique perspective on the space through your experiments, research, work you're doing. And happy to see how this will come together today. Quick introduction to the panelists. Alice Yuan Zhang, right next to me. You're a media artist, researcher, and cultural organizer. You can expand on that if you want. You're based in LA, but live in Berlin at the moment. And you have just done a research residency at the 0x Salon on DAOs, Decentralized Autonomous Organization. You can correct me if you like.
There's more context that we can get into, but yeah, roughly, yeah.
Okay, cool. Then Ela Kage, digital strategist at the intersection of technology, economy with culture and society, I would say. And we know each other also for quite a while, and you've been starting out from the open source, open culture space, going through all different incarnations of the web, I would say, platform cooperatives and so on. And you've been thinking a lot how to make things possible in a more collective and cooperative way. Is that correct?
I guess. Yeah.
And then Elio Achon. You're an artist and cultural organizer, and you work at the art space in Mahala in Schöneweide. And you've moved to Berlin from Accra, right, in Ghana?
2 years ago.
Okay. And then we have Callum Bowden, you're co-founder of Trust and Black Swan, two projects that I think we'll hear more about later. Both are networks or collectives that I think are interested in learning through experimenting and building, and are interested in infrastructure and technology when thinking about social and political developments.
Very well summarized.
Okay, cool. All right. So, I mean, you can all expand, I think, on your practice when we go along. I have planned two kind of big blocks for the conversation, and maybe a bigger, a step back, wrapping up in the end. And the first is looking into NFTs and what they change. So an NFT that kind of can mark the original of a digital work, that can make it ownable and tradable, can also make it an asset for speculation, for increase in value. And what changes that? Well, I would like to discuss the financial asset, but also the promises that are a bit attached with that. Is there's more money going to be available because and from different sources for the arts, because there is different people, there's a different incentive. Collective ownership would be an incentive, or the speculative potential of the NFT. So people would give money to the space of culture. And then also the promise or the idea of the distribution, that money goes to artists, to spaces, to people that maybe have not benefited so much from money available in the art world before. And I'm speaking like cultural space. I want to really, like, we can discuss really cross-cutting. I don't want to just talk about fine arts, where I think this has mostly materialized so far, but we can speak in broader terms. So yeah, I made up a broad question, but maybe we start with actually Elihu, if you like, because because also you are the one who are, I think, mostly interested in NFTs in this group. And you look at it from a perspective from like the West African art scene and so on. And this is maybe also a perspective that's not so much known over here. So what do you think, what changes, or what has already changed?
I think, yeah, like with the invent or with the introduction of every new thing, like NFTs or electric cars, it's always a learning ground. It's always, there's mistakes to be made and people learn. But like from an African perspective or a West African perspective, to be more exact, I'm coming from a place where I believe that art in itself should be very accessible to people. Art should be accessible to communities, and art should influence change. And initially, when I got into contact with NFTs, it was a bit confusing. I didn't really understand because I'm not a technical person. I'm very analog. I don't know how to use Photoshop. I really don't understand computers. But I found out that NFTs are able, when used properly, to effect change, to actually bring change to communities. And I mentioned to Andrea in one of our conversations that in Ghana, for example, there are artists, or across Africa, there are artists that are using NFTs, creating them, and then giving ownership of these NFTs to communities. So I see NFTs also as quite sustainable. I mean, not speaking about like the aspect of the environmental sustainability, but sustainability in terms of ownership. Now, what you see is that in communities in Ghana, rural communities and villages, there's always art that is made, and then most of this art we see in the West, like when you see publications, photos, stories that are coming out of Africa. Usually, it's a very skewed story. They show you the Africa with kids that are hungry, with people that are starving. They tell you stories about people not having water to drink. But with this NFT, like this movement, I realized that artists were now using these NFTs to tell African stories, but not the stories that create a pity party. So, for example, there are communities where artists go and they make paintings in a village that nobody knows. So, for example, we in this space have no idea where the village is, but the artist is there for 6 months doing a residency and working on an NFT project. Now, what happens is the NFTs that are created in this village, maybe in a building, the NFTs that are created, people that buy into this NFT then support the project. But it's not so invasive in a way that we don't have tourists and many people having like a gallery weekend where everybody's going to the village or to this community and interacting with them. But because of this NFT and this virtual space, we get to enjoy the art, and these people, like these communities, also get to benefit from the art, but in a way that is not really invasive to them. And also, they get their stories get told, they get to know their own stories, because artists are also doing research before producing bodies of work. So they are going through the archives, going through history, and telling the stories of these people in pictorial ways or using art. And this, for me, is a great thing about NFTs, because now these communities get to experience the art. It's no more, it's out of the four walls of a gallery. It's no more elitist, but it's everyday people interacting with the art. And then the people that support this project support it because they believe they want to support these communities or they want to help these communities, but it's not from the perspective of a pity party, but it's rather from a perspective of engaging with art, of learning and cultural exchange. So for me, coming from an African perspective, I think the role that NFTs play, although it's also relatively new, the role that NFTs are playing cannot be overlooked, and I think we really need to go more into them. Yeah.
So you, from that perspective, this idea of communities or artists in communities that have not received support before are now receiving support kind of through NFTs.
Yes, through
NFTs, and you link them. They're linked with people who did not like have a way. It's kind of a new channel, basically. To
yes. Yes, there are people, communities that don't really. Of course, art has always been in Africa, and art is very innate. Art comes from within us, but capitalism has created a new idea of what art is supposed to be. But with communities like this that are very grassroots, that are everyday people, this art is now being brought to them. You know, so they don't have to leave, maybe, I don't know, travel 50 kilometers to go to an art space, but artists have come together and they're like, okay, we are sort of adopting this community, we are creating art, we are selling this art as NFTs, and the funds that are generated then go to the development of these communities. You know, so there's a direct link between the art, the final product, the community, and the people. So there's a link that the NFT or that, the NFTs are creating. And I think that is important because in most places, sometimes the artist and the work, they're really separate. You can go to an art exhibition and a curator can tell you about the art piece or you can engage, but like there's no direct ownership, there's no direct relationship with the art. But with these projects and these communities, for example, it could be in the palace, or it could be on the community hospital. So this is somewhere where everyone is going to. So now all of a sudden, this art that was so elitist is now available to everybody. So they are not only seeing the art, they are also learning about their stories, and then they are also gaining something from this art through the work of the artists. Yeah, so for me, I find it really important, and I'm really curious to see how it develops and how like these artists can also collaborate with other groups of people, other artists and organizations to make this more of a common thing. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay. Carlo, how do you see from your perspective what changes through NFTs, or how do you see, like, from your perspective, now that you've heard this case from Ghana, what do you think about kind of the redistribution of money?
So I think it helps to give a bit of context about the work that I do. And I wear two hats. One is this project called Trust, which we describe as a network of utopian conspirators. It's part community, part collective of interdisciplinary researchers, technologists, practitioners, interested in enabling futures and horizons beyond unavoidable catastrophes. That was kind of the impetus behind starting the project. And the other hat that I wear that kind of emerged out of Trust, out of this research context, collective community research context, is a project called Black Swan, which focuses very specifically on what creative communities, the art world, creative practice can learn from blockchain without being too beholden to the claims of the blockchain industry. And so, although in 2017 we were very excited about blockchain's potential for distributing value differently within networks, thinking about different economic models for arts practices and communities more generally, we were very skeptical of the kind of marketing discourse that comes out of the blockchain industry. It has very few proven use cases besides inventing money. And this highly speculative side of blockchain was something that we wanted to find ways of understanding on our own terms and in our own context. I think hype technologies generally create hype through creating new terminology, creating jargon, creating words that other people don't necessarily understand, to create this kind of dazzlement or draw people into it. And so with Black Swan, we set out a 1.5 years of experiments to understand what are the psychosocial affordances of blockchains, and more specifically decentralized autonomous organizations, which are digital organizations facilitated perhaps somehow through a blockchain. And so we wanted to look at democratic decision-making mechanisms. We wanted to look at organizational formations and hierarchies. We wanted to look at modes of exchange and how multiple communities relate to each other economically. We also wanted to look at value and try and understand how creative practice generates a multiplicity of values that are not captured by narrow and reductive market values. So all this to say, I think that NFTs are a little bit blown out of proportion. I think that it's one part of many different tools that can be leveraged in both meaningful but perhaps more often extractive ways. I think the problem with NFTs is that most of the protocols that enable artists and creatives to create them benefit from the labor that the artists are putting into their platforms, whether it's by paying the minting costs or through network fees that they're paying or whatever. And I do think that it's true most people who mint an NFT do not make money from it, really. But I think, as Ellie was saying, the idea of holding value communally and holding value in communities and finding ways of indexing the values that communities are already creating and allowing that to somehow be owned by people is very interesting and very exciting. And I mean, a more analog example of the types of things I'm talking about are community currencies. They had one in Brixton in London. They just had a Brixton buck, I think it was called, that was only usable within this district of London, and shops had agreements where you could exchange this money, but it didn't have a market value really. And I think these more community-focused experiments with collective value are really interesting, but there's a lot more work to be done in figuring out what are the mechanics that actually do benefit people, and how can we design experiments to understand that people are benefiting and not the tech platforms as they are in the Web 2.0 world.
Yeah.
I think that's kind of builds that kind of development would also benefit kind of the projects that you've been laying out. Yeah. Alice, you've been taking notes.
Always.
Yeah.
As writing is also a technology.
Would you,
Gosh, where to start? I usually don't like to pick NFTs as the place to start in talking about this whole what's happening right now as this concept and cultural imaginary behind Web3 kind of surfaces and balloons and gets, as we mentioned, blown out of proportion. But also, as we start projecting, every one of us are our own fantasies and also needs, and as artists, as cultural workers, I myself a media artist, there is obviously the question of sustenance and money and how we could be sustainable in doing our work. But to take a step back, so my work in the past few years has had to do with telling ecological stories through new media, so 3D, AR, VR, all of these things. And then what's happened in the past year or so, since the onset last spring of like really just this rise of noise around NFTs as a new creator economy, et cetera. Since then, and then now through further developments and more context around decentralized autonomous organizations, et cetera, I've been going through a sort of exorcism, and I think that has been really helpful. So for me, what is really interesting is all of these questions, as well as the actual needs that we have and the problems that we currently have with surveillance capitalism, platform capitalism, all of the things that are wrong with our internet to date. These questions that have risen from this conversation are really interesting to think about. But the solutions that are the loudest, that are the most well-funded, that are the shiniest, that will make your computer go nuts trying to load a web3 page, may not necessarily be what we need in order to, take care of ourselves, our communities, our planet. And yeah, so coming back around to this question of ecology and what we hear as this kind of annoying sidebar around Web3 of like, oh, and then there's proof of work. Hopefully it's temporary. I hear there's a lot of mining. Don't know what's going on there, but maybe we should experiment anyway. And so there's a lot of that going on. And for me, it's not just ecological extraction that's some sort of band-aid that we have to go and look for a carbon offset solution toward, bless you. But it is the history of colonialist extraction, which also gives us where we are right now with our internet in terms of digital colonialism, right? So when we think about mining, there is proof of work mining, but there has been, this logic of capitalist, imperialist, colonialist extraction, however you want to call it, that has, of course, predated that. There's the mining of all of the devices, the rare minerals from, Democratic Republic of Congo and other places where folks are literally going out there to try and get rare minerals and metals so that we can continue our track of planned obsolescence with the devices that we have, right? And these are the devices we use in order to access the newer technological innovations, the decentralized apps, et cetera. In most cases, right? So there's talk around upcycling, e-waste, et cetera. At Republica this year, I'm seeing also some really interesting ideas and conversations around that. Great. Most of our stuff is not recycled. And I looked this up. It takes at least a million or 2 years to decompose any toxic waste, if at all. So there's that. There's more mining here. There's the mining of energy, right? Most of it is connected to fossil fuels still. So the electricity that we use, most of it in the US, in the last year, 61% is still fossil fuels. Of course, then if we think about renewable energy and electricity coming from, hydroelectric dams or other, renewable resources, we're again, even solar panels, we're again thinking about what makes up the hardware. So we're still here. And then there's the extraction and the mining and deliberate erasure and control through data, right? So data mining is still very much present with us, and there's an open question with Web3 how that impacts folks. But if we look at the history to date of data mining, there's a lot of harm that has come out of that is very much this question of who is doing the planning and who is being planned for. And of course, if we keep going back beyond just technological innovation and the history of digital colonialism that has led us to date, there's, just generally the extractive legacy that has really accumulated the wealth, the power, the knowledge, that that allows certain people to be able to access certain demographics, predominantly white men, et cetera, that of the global north specifically, predominantly these are the folks who are able to access the most quote-unquote complex or emergent technology. Meanwhile, we have issues like digital redlining in the US context where, half of folks in Detroit are not, have been deliberately designed against because they're deemed, not profitable by internet service providers to even put in bandwidth in the first place. Meanwhile, what I consider as emergent technology is actually coming from quote-unquote the margins. So, these folks in Detroit have been putting together their own mesh networks that comes directly with community organizing, political organizing, situated, accountable, collective work, right? That people will put in together in order to organize any sort of network infrastructure. And I think there's so many countless examples of this also in crisis, in times of crisis, right, where your communication, your connectivity technology comes down, and you need to communicate, when there's a hurricane or something like that. Also in times of protests, right, trying to really innovatively, because you also have to figure out how to connect with each other. So network technology, in that sense, I would say is really the emergent technology that we have not been paying as much attention to. There's a lot of history of decentralization there as well that has kind of then splintered off and gone into this Web3 conversation. But there's a lot more there if we do our homework. And then, and I think that then is very much connected with, it's not just a conversation about technology, it's a conversation about political organizing and community resilience and localizing and what that means. And that then brings us back to economics, right? To, how we even think about politics, how we think about relating to each other, how we think about the earth and food sovereignty and land sovereignty, et cetera. I mean, now we're here, so.
Yeah, this point is also, I think, what the previous panel kind of ended on, that the Web3 space opens a lot of imaginaries about how to organize, or because a joint organization, as you were laying out, Callum, a little bit like this kind of holding something in common through the technology, holding value in common, is kind of possible. So this kind of brings up lots of questions of cooperative organization. And then, all the points about the environment, I think this was actually the kind of last question, how I wanted to round it up. Is it all worth it, looking into it if we have all those environmental costs to bear? But maybe we can take it from here and then bring Ela in, because you've been working on cooperative work is your main, I think, focus of what you're working on. And how do you see with Web3, let's look at it now. We have to look in a wider way, as you were described, Alice. But let's look into Web3 and the promises of new organizations, new institutions. How can we organize ourselves differently, and what changes in that space? And I know you're also working, I think, on a project currently that particularly looks into this. So please.
Yeah, I think both questions are very closely intertwined. So if we want to discuss any phenomena within Web3, whatever it means, by the way, but there's automatically the question coming up on how to organize around that technology. And also the question of what is the mindset behind that technology, and what's actually the fantasy, the imagination behind. And yeah, just to share a little anecdote, which I found very interesting. I'm part of the Money Lab board. Money Lab is a series of events around money, financialization, and related effects. So we put out an essay prize and asking the question whether NFT is a tool of emancipation or basically ruining our collective imagination of how to create value. And it was really interesting to see that from the results we got, apparently we all have a really hard time in freeing our minds from the dominating narratives of capitalism. And we are so captured by the profitability, notions of ownership and scarcity, etc. So if we talk about, okay, let's own this together, let's organize things together, let's create a movement that really aims at social coordination at scale, I doubt that we are in a position to start doing that right away, because it's actually super complex. So coming back to what you said, Ellie, I really like the example you brought up, and I would be extremely interested in discussing the question of how to make that a sustainable experience, what you had with your community. Yeah. What will it take actually to activate our imagination? What will it take to really create notions of co-ownership that work on the long run? What does it take to come up with governance models that are accessible and adaptable for people? So all these questions completely remain outside the public conversation on NFTs. It's really amazing how limited the scope of conversation is on NFTs. And I have this strong wish to sort of expand that and to think really beyond it, because in and of itself, NFTs are, we can do a lot of good with it, we can do a lot of bad with it, but it's really about the frameworks we build. And I think if everything fails and if we don't manage to get deeper into these topics, then we see a space where there's an increase of scarcity in the digital sphere. There's more and more ownership in the digital landscape, because that's what NFTs do, to make them a tool for speculation and for sales, of course. And I'm also really interested in thinking of what is the nature of communities that we are establishing here, and what really allows for inclusion, and what helps us to express different voices, different opinions. There's a whole lot of, a whole curriculum of learning, unlearning related to that. So I think if we use NFTs or other Web3 related technologies to think of new models of organizing, then in the end it will not be about the mode of enterprise that we are going to build, or it won't be about the way of any specific way of collective organizing, but it will be about the fundamental questions that have been raised already in this conversation.
If I may, very good points from you and from Alice. Alice, right? So I think we have to start looking at it again from the root. So I want to go take a step back again, back to mining, and just look at the root of the word. So as a researcher, I also sometimes try to decolonize my thinking. I try to decolonize everything I do, because I realize that, like, as an African, as a black man, like, colonialism has done a very big number on all the colonized peoples of the world. And we see that not only in our sciences, we see that in religion, we see that in art, we see that in culture. Now, if you take mining, so to speak about ecology, before I speak about, like, community, you speak about how extractive and how invasive these technologies are. That's why I mentioned that, like, the sustainability within, like, the blockchain industry it goes two ways. So when there's ownership, when there's a project that has been created, and there's this, in my opinion, this collective ownership by a group of people, when an NFT or something has been created in the blockchain and not for the sole purpose of gain, of capital, that is a completely different conversation. So with that, because there's always the concept of the greater good, right? So of course, something's got to give. So yes, there's the possibility that, like, the process of mining, as we see, like the mining of the minerals and how it's destroying our earth, we do see from one aspect that this is not sustainable to the environment. But the use or the motive of creating of these NFTs, of these blockchain technologies, can be sustainable in a way that the society, if the society is benefiting, then that in itself is sustainable, because I believe that the earth, apart from the other organisms, we society also form like a very basic part of the progress of the earth. Because of course, if there were no human beings, or if we didn't exist, of course the world would exist and the planet would be maybe healthier. But there's also something that we as human beings bring to this conversation of the earth. So I think if organizations, or if blockchains will be created, and then created with people in mind, because until we move away from the capitalist ideals, until we move away from money, creating and based on speculations, okay, prices going up and down, until we move away from that, we are never going to really see the other things that this blockchain technology can bring to us, because our main focus ends up, or the focus of many people end up, it's always about how much can I make? And Callum was mentioning on these platforms, most of the time when you mint an NFT or you mint something, you don't even get anything. There's also the issue of the security of the space. And I realize that a lot of people are also losing, So I think if we would change our approach, I think it's also all about our approach. So if we would change our approach and decolonize our minds from thinking about only money and only about capital, but rather look at improving the lives of people, and improving the lives of people, or development should also be looked at in context. So for example, what may be referred to as development in Europe is not development in Africa, because there's always a narrative of an underdeveloped Africa, right? But then the truth of the matter is there's also development in Africa, which to what we see as normal, I don't find it in Europe. A typical example, for example, is this conversation about medical drones, right, that are sending, they are delivering drugs and first aid. And a couple of months, or maybe about a year or two ago, there was a really big fuss about medical drones delivering medicines, I don't know, in somewhere in Europe. But then in Africa, for many years, this has been happening because of other issues, maybe bad roads and too much rain, so cars cannot go there. But the technology of drones delivering medicine has already been, So I think we also have to reimagine and relearn and unlearn some of these things on development and what it means on support and progress and what that means. So if we get to a place where we are looking at sustainability, we are looking at helping and building a society, but we are not looking at the everyday metrics of, for example, good roads, but we begin to look at the quality of life of people, then everything changes, because through blockchain and through projects in West Africa or in Africa that are supporting communities, what you see is that when these people get in touch with the art, right, and I speak mostly about art because that is where my interest lies as an artist, most of these people, when they begin to see the stories of their people, they begin to see images, stories, and oral tradition translated into images. Sometimes just the look on their face, they begin to understand things that were very abstract to them gets clearer, and you see that the quality of their lives improve. They begin to see that, okay, so I am not a third world person as the global north wants me to think, or as the narrative goes, So I think if we are able to move from looking at it from a point of view of making money or solely making profit, but looking at the quality of lives and the impact of lives, I think then maybe we can also begin to look at the more positives of blockchain technology.
I like how you all bring in because I think a big kind of criticism towards blockchain technology is that it kind of enforces capitalism more on the internet, because it has ownership and payments and stuff, and is based on kind of accounting technology. But you are all bringing in this idea of, how can we actually unlearn those kind of conditionings and do something else with it? So kind of opening up the space. Maybe Callum, this is a good point for you to comment, because you've been thinking a lot about new organizational structures, and maybe you can share a little bit of the findings that you've had with your projects.
And I just wanted to add on the idea of like decolonization. When you decolonize the idea of technology, you also understand it's not just shiny hardware that comes out of Silicon Valley that is technological. Yes. Like being technological is fundamental to being human. Yeah. Speaking on a stage right now, we are using technology with the language that we're using. The gestures that people use to interact with each other is technological. Cooking is technological. You know, all of these things are very complex, high advanced technologies. And I think this is something that Ella was also mentioning. Blockchain often is spoken about in a way of like removing, purifying out, automating human relations. The decentralized autonomous organization, as it was described by Vitalik Buterin in like 2016, talks about creating automated organizations that don't need humans to make decisions anymore. And I think this is a completely false way of thinking about technology. And it's about the social practices that coalesce to act technically that are what are important and actually the hardest thing to manifest. Yeah, as kind of Ella was talking about, that's the hardest project, is how do we create the conditions and relations and communities that can act in post-capitalist, non-extractive ways. And in the work that I've been doing, we really wanted to prototype ways of responding to critique. We became dissatisfied with being so filled with critique, or understanding that the world is so messed up, understanding that digital platforms are selling us as products to advertisers, understanding that people my age will never be able to own a home. In the US, people don't have access to healthcare. All of these things, like, we understand the critique, but how do we begin responding to the critique? And so we wanted to employ like paper prototyping techniques, take an experimental approach where we can test our hypotheses about things and unpack our assumptions to understand with our very specific community in Berlin what works and what doesn't work. How does it feel for people to engage in these systems? All to say that, like, I have never employed a blockchain in any of my work. We've always done things without a blockchain. We talk about it as blockchain thinking without relying on the technology itself. I think it's been very interesting for catalyzing the imagination around different forms of organizing and different economic models and the possibilities of these phenomena, but actually you don't really need a blockchain to do most of the things that people claim a blockchain is needed to do. I'm still not entirely sure what you need a blockchain to do. My favorite way of describing a DAO at the moment is it's a group chat and a spreadsheet. You could all put in the money that you've received into your spreadsheet, your distributed ledger, and then you could just have a transparent budget, like a co-budgeting. And this is basically what an organization called Open Collectives is doing in a really interesting way. All to say, in the experiments that we've done, we've tested different decision-making mechanisms. We looked at one person, one vote versus lotteries versus something called Quadratic Voting, which is a multi-voting mechanic that comes from an economist called Glenn Weil. That's thinking more about how you ensure in systems like blockchain where people are voting with financial capital. Often in blockchain, people with the most tokens have the strongest vote. How do you ensure that less dominant people also have a voice? And so Glenn Weil proposes quadratic voting as a way of expressing a higher preference costs exponentially more. So people spend these things called voice credits that then the square root is taken to calculate the vote. So if you spend 25 voice credits on a proposal that you like, your vote will be 5. If you spend 100 voice credits on a proposal, your vote will be 10. So you get less and less power out of your voice credits the more you concentrate them into a single thing. All to say, this is like complicated for me also. It's like very confusing. It's not clear how it works. So we wanted to test this against something easier to understand, like one person, one vote, and something that removed agency, a lottery. And we tested this initially with 10 trust members. And we're really surprised that people preferred quadratic voting because it allows you to say, you like this thing a little bit, I like this thing a little bit, I like this thing more, I don't like this thing. And ultimately, people had a greater investment in a wider range of things, and it kind of had it becomes a nice way of finding the most preferable compromise in our tests. And so from this, we developed an application called Signet, which tries to make quadratic voting feel very intuitive. One of the downsides that people we were working with said is they don't understand how it works. This dynamic between the voice credits and the votes you get is very hard to understand. And so we tried to create visual indicators that show you how much power you're getting out of your voice credit depending on how you move your voice credits around. This doesn't use a blockchain at all anymore, or it never used a blockchain, but now, interestingly, there's more interest in it from the blockchain community or from people who work in blockchains, which I think is fascinating because if the blockchain actually worked, maybe they wouldn't be interested in a non-blockchain decision-making tool, but...
I have 2 points.
Please. You've also done like lots of research recently into those processes with decentralized autonomous organizations, no? So,
I wanted to say about this, like, what are we bringing? What is the curiosity that is fueling the space that then also, chicken or egg, there's also so much capital and resources coming into this space. And I wanted to go back to your point about visibility and my question around that is, what is the cultural imaginary? What are the narratives and the motivations that are finally making possible this particular way of reparations, if we can call it that, or redistribution of wealth? And I ask this from also my subjective, lived experience as an Asian American woman, first generation, with a very intimate understanding that one's culture and background can get flattened under this, in between the hypersexualization and stereotypes, and then the erasure that happens simultaneously. And for me, also, this question stays as a media artist who has been trying to tell stories increasingly more, ancestral ecologies and these stories that. Alongside and representing, my cultural community and my own lived experience, et cetera, and then meanwhile asking what is the platter that I'm serving it on, that up for consumption or whatever it is, and what is the gaze that is coming back, that I'm delivering to, and who am I actually serving? Right, or in conversation with, even better. And so then bringing it back to my second point about locality, or we've talked about, in different words, situated or a specific context, or, trying to organize at the human scale, at the relational scale, right? So that we can actually work as a community. What does that actually mean? It comes up as a word so often in the DAOs and web3 space. And to me, and I'm just also a constellation of a lot of things, including the U.S. Context and the Just Transition Framework, and a lot more there. And also, what folks have been doing at Open Collective and Art Co-op, there's more to learn from there as well. They have like a gigantic list of very tangible, actionable strategies, from community land trusts to, like local situated currencies, to time banks, to loan funds, et cetera, that are non-extractive and trying to move us through what is called a values filter, so that we can, think about the earth, remember that we are interdependent on each other, remember our various responsibilities. And so, all of that to say that my current understanding of community is really long-term mutual accountability, something that I don't really see a lot of in the louder, web3 corners, of conversation or quote-unquote experimentation, innovation. And not to say that, there's I think it's also not exactly the most helpful to, point all of our criticality toward the technology itself. As Caleb said, all of this is technology. Fire is a technology. But at the same time, there's caution toward watching a fire, right? And there's needs. At a certain point, we might want to be cooking food. At a certain point, we might need to put it out because it's going to cause a wildfire. So it comes back around to, what does a particular community need? How do we think about appropriate technologies? How do we think about beyond this dichotomy of high and low tech and linear forward progression, but actually bring our imagination into more of a cyclical understanding, right, of, everything that we can make and where it comes from, but also where does it go? And again, with decolonization and with our cultural imaginaries and these particular Western, more elite spaces, we don't really talk about grief. We don't talk about death and decay and decomposition. And this is something that I feel, I'm drawing also from a very devout Buddhist mother who I try and have some of these conversations with and learn from. And and I think it's personally applicable. It's applicable at a local, regional, community level, where things come from, where they go, whether they're coming into a cycle and a decomposable cycle, rather than just productive and a one-way kind of innovation toward technology for its own sake. So in a sense, it's cultural work, it's spiritual work, it's political, and the technology follows.
Yeah.
So I think lots of the things that you talked about are, I think, get materialized also if you organize on a physical, a local level. I think with the kind of Web3 promise is also this promise of scale, or bringing people from all over the world who care about something together so they can contribute and we can make something happen, and then make something happen together with people coming, where I think many of those things, where you were saying grief and mutual accountability and all those things, are probably difficult to kind of have in that in that space. Maybe, and I think this is also one point of your criticism of it, or
Quick clarification.
I wanted to bring Ela in for the
on locality is, I don't mean purely geographical, right? We don't live in that sort of ecosystem necessarily, and yes, it is important, but it also locality as in relational and purpose locality, and and I mean, organizing kind of builds up in that fractal way rather than a dichotomy of local versus global versus planetary.
Maybe to also keeping time, bring it maybe back to Ela on your experience, what I just said about the different ideas of what is a collective organization and what Web3 in particular can bring to that space. How do you see that in comparison to like other proposals? Or like where do you think would lie a particular thing that you're interested in what like the DAO or Web3 space brings into this?
Yeah, I mean, basically, I think a lot of has been addressed already, but there's one thing we didn't get to talk about, and that's ownership or collective ownership. And I think this really sits at the very core of Web3, because it is the web of ownership ultimately, because we are able to sort of put value to many different things, whether it's NFTs, whether it's social interactions, whether it's voting. I mean, there's plenty of opportunities within Web3. So that brings me to the question of what does ownership mean in a digital space, and what comes with ownership? And we have that debate here in Berlin. If we, for instance, look at the referendum expropriate Deutsche Wohnen und Co., Deutsche Wohnen und Co. enteignen, where there is this claim of putting a cap on the amount of apartments that a single owner or a company can own, possibly, because and that's the idea behind that. There is there's an amount of apartments and houses. If this is in private ownership, it automatically leads to I mean the worst case scenarios of capitalistic exploitation, extractivism. So what we start to discuss just now is the responsibility that comes with ownership. So what does it mean if we take care of something together? That was already mentioned in the conversation, which is actually it's a question that the Commons research has put forward for many years. What does it mean to really cultivate a resource together, be it natural, be it digital, be it the right to speak, be it a certain cultural component that is very important for community building, be it any kind of cultural technology, as we heard. So I really think that the whole conversation on Web3 opens up a great opportunity to reintroduce ownership and really look at all its facets and varieties, from individual ownership and the question of, is it really okay to own land at all? Is that what we want? Is it better if land is co-owned? Is that better? Or is that just another form of enclosure? All these questions are, I think, really relevant. And another dimension of that is probably the question of legal forms that allow for co-ownership. And that would be, for instance, cooperatives, it would be maybe DAOs, we don't know. But we might get to a point where DAOs will be legally registered. I think it already is possible in the US, in 1 or 2 states, as far as I know, but not here in Europe. If we look at the whole platform cooperativism movement that strives at building alternatives to the market monopolies, this is really about the question of how to own something together, how to create access for not only the members of that cooperative, but also for others who want to use the service. Yeah, so that would be my big question that I would like to dig deeper in. Yeah.
Yeah, and this owning together also, I think, then leads to this promise of like more equal distribution and less extractive relationship between each other. We are coming slowly already to a close, so I would like maybe to ask, like, I think you, Ela, you have already put out a question. Maybe for the others also to round off, kind of go a bit like with like Ela's thinking. What are you interested in from here? Like, what do you find? What do you find important to think about? What you want to still share with the audience, like from Web3, like an area that you find should be maybe discussed in a panel next year or something.
I'm happy that Ella brought it back to like a point of somewhat optimism, because my participation in web3 or blockchain or whatever this is comes from a place of believing that we should increase participation in the development of technology. And blockchain is still so early that it's exciting to see people like on this stage asking difficult questions while still wanting to contribute to pushing for futures that they believe in. I think my questions are very similar to Ella's, like, how do you own something together? Something that we've talked a lot about in the trust context. Is owning really the right framework for a community? Something an artist and friend, Sarah Friend, once said that was a really nice summary is, markets need liquidity, communities need stability. And that's like a very clear dissonance between tokenification, hyper-financialization, and like solidarity. I think that there are ways that blockchains can be used for solidarity, but we need to experiment more with possible ways of doing that.
How about like Eli or Alice? Do you have any final thoughts to share? You don't have to, but if you want.
No, not really. I think I also am with Ella and Callum on the conversation of ownership still, because I really believe that for us to make to make proper progress, whatever that means, or for us to actually realize something out of this, we need to really understand ownership and what it means. And for me, I think the only way, if a community, if all of us in this room, for example, say we own this Republica concept, the concept of these talks, I think then we look at it with more care and more thought. So for me, I'm also curious, my question is to understand the human relationships, or what human behavior can change when we begin to look at something without thinking of gain. So if we would all look at how can we make the world a better place, or how can we make X better, but without gain, so making it better for the next person. So I'm really curious about that, like what the world would look like.
Yeah, definitely on board with the core questions here. And I would just add that ownership is a bit of a strategy. I'm going back to Fred Moten and Stefano Harney in the Undercommons, where they say, we're telling all of you, but we're not telling anyone else. There's something to this tension of, a wall or a membrane, like, and for who, and with what needs are we considering ownership, and also what is ownership as a practice, rather than as a sort of end all be all like asymptote of justice. It's a sort of negotiation and an understanding that you have to continue to practice with each other. So I really appreciate that last point, and I think it's an interesting strategy to understand in the toolbox toward everyday justice.
Okay, well, thank you very much for your contributions. I like how we kind of brought it, that we're ending on this kind of community organizing, community like governance, and how to do this, while also the tools kind of promise this is kind of automated. So, but how do we actually do it? And I think this is also an opportunity that those tools kind of open those questions up, and maybe more people think about collective organizing now. I see this as really like as a good development coming out of that space, no matter if we're using the tools after all or not, or if we, go with something else that is maybe less environmentally extractive. Okay, thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you too.